sit back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books.
Hi guys! So I am here today to do a joint review of 3 short story collections that I recently read. The first one I was sent by a publisher for review, the other 2 I picked up myself. So I'm going to start with the one from a publisher, and that one is Dreams of Distant Shores, which is by Patricia A. McKillop. It's the first Patricia A. McKillop book I've ever read, although I did recently pick up 2 of her novels, so I'm very glad to have read the short story collection first, which it kind of gave me a little bit of a teaser into her work, and I really enjoyed this overall. I definitely think there are some stories that were better than others, but as a whole I would say I definitely liked this, and I think there are some really, really good ones within this. Some of the stories within this felt very classical indeed. I think Patricia A. McKillop definitely has that classic fantasy style going on. Not so much big epic quests and Hobbit style stuff. It's a lot more sort of fairy tale-esque, that side of things, which I liked a lot. I was definitely intrigued by her approach to storytelling. I think the cover of Patricia A. McKillop's books kind of does her a slight disservice, although I do really like the cover designs, because the cover designs are quite classic fantasy in tone. I mean, they look quite old school, and that doesn't necessarily show her to be an author who writes up-to-date stuff. But I will say that I think she does do that. If you want to pick up some of her work, but you're kind of thinking, oh, maybe it's a bit stale or a bit old, it's not. It has a classic feel to it, but it's not old, it's not dull, it's still filled with interesting ideas. McKillop does tend to focus on quite classical tropes within her stories, so we have like classic witches and wizards, we have mermaids, we even have aliens, but she brings these a kind of unique twist. Even though they're quite overdone, overused fantasy tropes and sci-fi tropes, she brings her own unique twist to it, so I liked that about her. There are some super short stories within this, but there are 2 really long ones within this. I tended to find that the longer stories were better in my opinion, just because I could immerse myself a bit more. I felt like they were more completed, and that always helps me. So for me, the longer ones definitely worked better. That's not to say that the short stories were bad. I think they were all decent stories. I don't think there was a particular one in here that I hated, but there's just not so much development, and so it was a bit harder to connect with the characters. Sometimes short stories work for like really weird, surreal stuff, but I don't think that's what she does. I think she just tells very short, very sweet fairy tale-esque stories with unique twists, and I think they still need a bit more development than the really short ones in this had. So I'm going to tell you guys about some of the ones that I really enjoyed. The first one I really liked was called Aliens, and this was a kind of wacky story about aliens, obviously. It's about a grandmother and her family are kind of looking to her to come out to a party with them, but she is saying she can't because she needs to stay home so that the aliens can come to her. And of course a lot of her family think, well, she's the old one in the family, maybe she's just kind of going a bit senile now, but actually there might be some truth to her words and the aliens might be real. I liked that one a lot. I found it quite comical and quite true to how people are. They kind of just dismiss that person's opinion because she was older, but I think it was quite an interesting story and quite an interesting look and take on aliens, and also the sort of family dynamic, so I liked that one, definitely liked that one. The next one I liked was called Witch, as in Witch of the Witches, and it was a story about witches and their familiars, and we follow a young girl who's only recently kind of connected with her familiar, so they're not great at communicating with each other because she hasn't yet learned Crow and he is a crow, and as we are following her and her story, she is actually being threatened along with some of the other witch friends that she has by this evil thing. We're not really sure what it is, and her familiar is trying to warn her about it, but it's not going so well because everything's getting a little bit lost in translation. So I liked this, it was quite funny, and obviously I just enjoyed the fact that it wasn't just witches casting spells, it was kind of about witches and their relationship to familiars, which is kind of a cool twist. The next one was one of the longer ones, and it's called The Gorgon in the Cupboard, and this is all about a Medusa-like head that is in the cupboard of this artist, and this artist is kind of slightly a failing artist. He doesn't really feel like his work is up to par with some of the other artists local to him, so he's going around trying to find the perfect muse so that he can create the best piece ever, his like absolute masterpiece, and the whole time he's going around doing this, every time he comes back to his house, he talks to this Gorgon in the cupboard and it gives him advice. It's a pretty weird story when I think about it, but all of them are, and it's quite charming at times too. The final one is probably the one I most enjoyed, and this one is called Something Rich and Strange. During this one, it's mostly focused on sort of mermaids and underwater creatures that might lure people into the depths. It's quite dark at times, but it also focuses a lot on the allure of the sea and how people can get swept away by it, people can die under its surface, people can kind of be lured into it in the middle of night time, and I definitely found this one the most evocative in terms of like emotion and in terms of visuals. I could imagine this one a lot clearer than some of the others in my mind. I just really enjoyed the characters for this one as well. I thought that the whole thing worked quite well. Yeah, it was really interesting. Probably my favourite one in the whole collection. So those were my favourites from this one. As a whole, I'd say this is a good read, definitely worth picking up. If you're interested in trying out some of McKillop's work, it's a great start point, and I definitely think I will carry on with some of her other works in the future. So thank you to Tachyon for sending this to me. I was really grateful to receive it, and I have a few others for review from them, so I'm definitely going to get to them soon. I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars overall, and I would recommend it. The next one I have to talk to you guys about is a little bit more of a surreal magical realism story rather than fairy tale stories, and this is Broken Things by Padrika Tarrant, and I believe she's got a couple of other books out as well, but this is the first one of hers that I read. I actually picked this up on Jen's recommendation, Jen Campbell, I'll link her channel, and I picked this up as part of the Mental Health Awareness Readathon, and I'm very glad I did because reading it in the light of that was pretty interesting. These are quite magical realism stories, but they definitely all seem to have a focus on mental health and mental well-being and madness, and I liked a lot being able to go into this and read it with that in mind, because I think that really made some of these stories a little bit more personal and a little bit more interesting to me. I would say that this collection is probably a combination of creepy and enchanting all at once. This is a very, very short collection, which means that the short stories within this are pretty tiny most of the time, and there are a lot of them. Some of them I wasn't as interested in as others, some of them just didn't have that emotional impact behind them, but a lot of them did, and so I'm going to tell you about some of my favourites from this collection. The first one I read, I think is the very first one in the collection, is called Darling, and it's about this dog which has been found in the road. It was both heartwarming and chilling all at once, because it's about this character who finds this dead animal and then proceeds to go on and believe it's still alive and treat it as though it is. And it's kind of creepy, but it's kind of wonderful all at once. The next one was called Vanity, and this one was quite a peculiar but sad story. It's about a seagull who is struggling to fly, and I think there were a lot of sort of metaphors for real life and struggling day to day. We had one story called Waiting, which is a particularly lonely story about a woman who is constantly just waiting for her husband. She looked down on the people around her quite a lot and judged them, but she didn't really take a long, cold, hard look at her own life and assess it for what it really is and see what it really was. The next one was called Blade, and I think this is probably one of my most favourites from the collection. It's about a young person who finds a blade and uses it. It hints at something terrible and tragic that's happened with a really cold, calm detachment, and I didn't like the feelings it gave me. It made me quite uncomfortable, but I liked that it gave me those feelings, if that makes sense. It was uncomfortable to read, it was quite chilling to read, but it worked as a story, and it definitely made me think and made me wonder what had gone on. The next one was called Demon, and it was about this weird demon-like creature that was found by this lady, and she raised it as her own. It reminded me a bit of like the Pandora box story. We then had Witness, which is about a narrator who can feel everything on her estate and feel what people are up to in the dead of night, what kind of creepy things they end up doing, what sexual things they end up doing. Definitely made me certain I did not want an ability like that. It's pretty dark. Another one that reminded me of another story was called Love, and this one reminded me quite heavily of Pinocchio. It's about a young woman who's trying to sew herself a child because she's desperately lonely. It's quite dark. I mean, a lot of these are quite dark, let's be honest. The whole collection is fairly dark. The final one that I want to talk about is called Mending, and I think this one most closely relates to the title of the whole collection, which is of course Broken Things. This one is about a woman who is just desperate to mend things. She wants to create and she wants to mend things. It's one of the most tragic and yet imaginative stories in the collection. I definitely found this one to be the one that I connected with most and that I found the most sympathy for the main character. I just adored the way that this story went. I think the turns and the twists that she made with this were very sad, were very devastating, and I just enjoyed this story a lot. So overall, this collection is quite dark, quite creepy, quite filled with uncomfortable moments, but I definitely enjoyed it, and I do think it's a collection I would recommend to a lot of people. I certainly want to pick up her novel because I think that on a longer format, some of these stories could have been a lot better than they were. Even though I enjoyed them as they were, I think some of them would have been better in longer form, and so I would like to see how she does with a novel-length story. I think it could be pretty interesting, and I definitely want to pick up her other book. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars, so it's certainly one I would highly recommend to you to check out, and I will be keeping an eye out on this author for whatever she publishes in future, and hopefully picking up some of her other work soon, because, yeah, it was such an intriguing read, and she definitely was one of those authors who lived quite firmly in the times. Some of her stories were very of the modern day, a lot of them were very present, talking about sort of the shops that are around today and things like that, so I like that a lot too. If you like things like Lost Hope and Lonely Souls and Broken Things and fairy tales, then this might be something that you want to check out. The final one that I have to talk to you guys about is called Jagannath, and this is written by Karin Tidbeck, who is a Swedish author, but she writes in both Swedish and in English, so she wrote this collection, I believe, mostly in English, and then some of them are translated from her Swedish works. This collection definitely had a distinct Nordic feel to it. A lot of the stories within this feel quite Nordic, they feel very rooted in Sweden, and I like that a lot because I haven't really read an awful lot of Swedish fiction. What I've read I've enjoyed a lot, so that's good. This collection was fantastic from the very first one. I really enjoyed the first story within this. The first story was called Beatrice, and it was about a hot air balloon and a man, and the man falls in love with the hot air balloon, not just in a he wants to buy it way, he literally falls in love with this hot air balloon. And then we also follow a woman who falls in love with a train. It's bizarre, but it's so beautifully written and so heartwarming. I never thought I would feel sympathy for a man falling in love with a hot air balloon, but I did. And it was wonderful. The next one I really enjoyed was called Rebecca, and Rebecca was really dark as a story. It's quite sad straight away. You know that there's been abuse and that there's been sadness and devastation, particularly for this one girl called Rebecca, and she's telling her friend about everything that's happened and how hopeless she's feeling. It's very sad, and then the ending of this one was quite surprising. The next one I really liked is called Who is Arvid Pecton? And this is the story of a phone operator who gets rung up by various different people and has to kind of answer their queries. One day he gets someone on the phone who is looking specifically for him, and he realises that he doesn't quite know himself, and everyone around him doesn't really know him anymore, and it's quite sinister. The next one I liked is called Britta's Holiday Village, and this relates back to a traditional Swedish folk story, which is all about the Vittras. It's the story of a Vittra in a red dress and a family who has madness in its history, and the people who are of the younger generation are trying to find out a bit more about the ancestors and whether or not they might have the madness in their own brain and blood. The next one I really liked was called Cloudberry Jam, and this is about a young narrator who decides to grow a companion only to see that that companion kind of takes on a world of its own and a personality of its own and develops in some very peculiar ways. The next one I really enjoyed was called Augusta Prima, and this is definitely a take on Alice in Wonderland. It kind of relates back to the croquet match of Alice in Wonderland and also time. It's a bit bizarre, it's a bit wacky, it kind of deals with some big topics that I really liked seeing, and I particularly love Alice in Wonderland as a story, so seeing adaptations that are good is always a good thing, and this was definitely a good one. Then there was Aunts, which is a particularly gory story. If you're not into gory stuff, maybe skip over this one, because it's gory. It definitely goes into detail about like insides of bodies, and it's quite gruesome. There's fat and juices sort of discussed in this book, so just be aware. that story has that sort of stuff in it. If you don't like quite visceral tellings of bodies and bodily functions and that sort of stuff, you're probably not going to like this one, but I definitely did. It's creepy as can be, weird, so weird, but very imaginative. And the final one in this story collection is called Jagannath, which is obviously the title of the whole thing, and this is quite steampunk in a way. I liked this one a lot, focused on the inside of a giant metal being with lots of tiny people or characters who live inside to make this being work. They have to like oil the engines and make sure that everything is pumping and working, and basically look after this giant beast which is roaming around doing stuff in our world. So it's quite weird, it's quite bizarre, but I definitely liked it, and I think it was one of my favourites in the collection. Out of the whole collection, I'd say Beatrice, Augusta Prima and Jagannath are my favourite three, but honestly this whole collection was pretty solid for me, and I think all of them were really strong stories, and even though they're all quite short, I definitely enjoyed them, so I certainly will be picking up some of her other work soon. Definitely one I'd recommend if you like magical realism, if you like creepy but imaginative stuff, then this is an excellent read. And yeah, I'd definitely love to hear if you guys have read any of these three, or if you have any other recommendations of sort of similar styles of writing, similar authors, similar books, then do let me know in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.